There's still quite a bit for us to learn about Dart and Flutter, so in this section, we're going to start working on our next application. Now, I'm pretty excited about this next app because it's going to include a couple of features that you probably really want to know about Dart and Flutter. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is generate a new application. So once again, I'm back at a workspace directory of sorts inside of my terminal. Back here, I'm going to run flutter create, and then the name of the app that we're going to create is simply called news, like so. So while that installation runs, let's talk about the app we're going to make by taking a look at a couple of mockups over here. Okay, so this is a mockup of what we're going to be building. It's going to be essentially a news viewing application. When a user first boots up our application, they'll see a app bar or a header at the top, and then listed underneath that will show a collection of different news stories. Every story that we load up is going to have a title, some number of upvotes associated with it, and then a listing of the number of comments that users have associated with each of these stories. If a user taps on one of these tiles or one of these stories right here, we'll then take them to a detail page that will tell them a little bit more about the story that they're trying to look at. On the story detail, we'll show some summary of the story or just some more information about this particular news item. And then underneath that, we'll show a list of all the comments that have been created and associated with the story. Now, the source of news that we're going to be working with here is what is going to make this application so interesting. So all of the news items on here are going to be pulled from a public free API that is hosted by a website called Hacker News. Hacker News is a very popular tech-based website with tons of different news submitted by users, all about different tech topics. So I'm at news.ycombinator.com. That is the address for Hacker News. You can see here on the front page of Hacker News that there's a listing of different news stories. So each of these represents a separate individual story. Every single story has some number of points or upvotes associated with it, and every story has some number of comments associated with it as well. And so if I say, look at the listing of comments with this particular story right here, I can click on 49 comments, and I then get taken to a listing of all the comments that are associated with that story. So essentially, these are the same comments that you and I are going to want to print out on this detail page right here. As a quick side note, if you've never taken a look at Hacker News before, it really is a terrific site of kind of getting a pulse on the tech community. I personally read it quite a bit day to day, maybe a little bit too much, but that's a different story. Now, again, the reason this application is so interesting is because we are using the Hacker News API. It's not just the fact that we're showing stories from Hacker News that makes it interesting, it's the way in which their API works that makes this app interesting. So let's take a quick pause, we'll come back to the next section, we'll take a look at the API, and we'll get a better sense of why our app is going to be a little bit more challenging or a little bit more interesting. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we started talking about the next application that we're going to put together. At the end, I had said that there's going to be some interesting challenges around this application. So in this section, we're going to take a look at the Hacker News API, which we're going to use to retrieve stories and comments from this website. We'll get a better idea of why this is going to be challenging and exactly what the nature of that challenge is going to be. So first, here's the link to the documentation that we're going to look at. So I encourage you to open up a new browser tab and navigate to github.com/hackernews/API. So I've already pulled up the documentation. Here it is right here. It's hosted on a GitHub repository, and everything you need to know about it is listed inside the repository's README. So if you want to, absolutely feel free to pause the video here, take a quick glance through, but in this section, I'm going to point out some of the highlights that you need to be aware of. So the first thing I want to tell you is that every single resource that you and I are going to work with on this API or for this Hacker News API, we refer to as an item. So if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see this section right here marked items. So stories, comments, job-seeking posts, everything on Hacker News is represented over this API as something that we call an item. An item is an object that has all the properties that you see listed right here. So every single story, like this right here is a story. Number 1 is a story. Number 2 is a story. Number 3 is a story. Those are all instances of items. Every item has an ID. It has a type associated with it, so it can be a job, story, comment. It lists its author. It has the text associated with it, the title associated with it, and a couple of other properties that you can see listed inside of here. So throughout this entire application, as we start building the app, we're going to be referring to things as items. And sometimes when we say the word item, we're talking about a story that people can post comments on. And sometimes we'll be referring to an actual comment that someone has added to a story. They are all technically referred to as items. Now, if you think back to our mockup right here, you'll see that the first page that a user is going to land on is going to have a list of a bunch of different stories immediately presented to our user. And so one of the first things we need to figure out how to do with this API is get some initial list of items to show on the screen when a user first opens the app. So if we go back over the documentation and go on down towards the very bottom, so down, 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 and we can see a section right here called Live Data. And inside of Live Data is a section labeled New, Top, and Best Stories. So this is an API endpoint right here that retrieves all of the top stories that are currently trending on the website. This top stories endpoint right here matches up with all the stories that you see on the homepage of Hacker News right here. So these are all what are referred to as current top stories. Now, when we make a request to this endpoint, what we get back in return is a list of IDs, each of which represent one of these top stories. Now, the documentation here might be a little bit challenging to get through, so let's look at a diagram or two that's going to give you a better idea of what this endpoint is really going to do for us. Okay, here we go. So we're going to start off at kind of the top row of this diagram, just this section right here. So in order to get a list of stories to show on the homepage of our application, you and I are going to make an HTTP GET request to this endpoint of v0/top stories. And so in total, the actual request that we're going to make will be something like this one right here. So we'll make a request to hacker-news.com, firebase.io.com/v0/top stories. As a response, we're going to be given a list of IDs, and these are the IDs of each top story. Now, when we get back this list of top stories, all we get back is the list of IDs. We get absolutely nothing else. So for us to actually turn these IDs into an item so that we can know its title, its number of comments, and all that kind of good stuff associated with it, we have to then take each of these IDs and make a follow-up request to the Hacker News API. So we're going to say, take this first top story right here that has an ID of 10, and we're going to make a follow-up request to a second endpoint. And this second endpoint is something like v0/item/ the ID of the item that we want to fetch. So then in exchange for that, we'll get back some information about that particular story. Now, when I describe that process right there, something might seem a little bit fishy. So everything I laid out was to say that when we want to get a list of posts to show on this home screen right here, I just told you that we're going to have to make a request to top stories. We're going to get back a list of IDs. And then for each individual one of these IDs, we're going to have to make a follow-up request to this endpoint right here to get information about that particular story. So if that sounds a little bit strange to you, if it sounds like that's a little bit inefficient, it is, in fact, very inefficient. So the reason that this API is going to be so interesting, and this entire application is going to be so interesting, is that working with the Hacker News API requires a tremendous amount of network requests to be issued. Think about it. For you and I to just show this homepage right here, we're going to have to first make one request to get the IDs of each of these top stories. And then for each individual story, we're going to have to make a second request to fetch some information about that respective story. So if we want to show 50 different stories on here when a user first loads up our application, we're going to have to make 51 separate network requests. One to get the initial list of IDs of those 50 top stories, and then an additional 50 requests to fetch the details about each particular story. Now, if that sounds bad, well, that's not even the bad part. Trust me, that's not even the bad part. Let's talk about where this API gets really nasty. So let's imagine that you and I get that list of IDs. We make some follow-up request to get information about, say, the item model for story 10, and we get back some of those different properties that we were just looking at in the documentation. So we will be told the title of the story, the score, the author. We'll get something called descendants, which is the number of comments that are associated with the story. And then we also get a property called kids. So kids right here is going to be a list of integers. Kids is a list of IDs that reflect all the different comments that have been associated with this item right here. And so to fetch those comments, we're then going to have to make another follow-up request for details about this comment, and this comment, and this comment, and this comment, and this comment. So essentially, every time you and I want to show a list of stories, we have to make a tremendous number of requests. And then if we want to show details about one particular story, we have to make another tremendous number of requests. We have to make one request for every single comment that is associated with this story. And so that means that if there's some particular story that has many comments associated with it, like look at this one right here, this one has 58, this one has 144 comments, and I'm sure we can find some with even more than that. Here's 92, 79. So for every one of those comments, you and I are going to have to make a separate network request. So that's the big challenge behind this application. We're going to have to figure out a couple of different ways or some different strategies to somehow minimize or somehow negotiate or deal with the number of network requests that we're going to have to make from our mobile application. Just to make sure it's really clear, every single time our app has to make a request, in general, we want to minimize the number of requests going out, because every request that goes out consumes some amount of battery power, it takes some amount of performance impact, it eats up your user's bandwidth, and there's always the potential that that request is going to fail. And so this tremendous number of requests that we're going to have to make to power our application is going to be a huge challenge as we're putting this together. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here because we've gone a little bit long. There's a couple more items I want to clarify around this app, so another quick pause, and we'll come back and keep talking about a couple odds and ends in the next section. In the last section, we started talking about some of the big challenges with this next application we're going to be working on. Now again, all these challenges are going to be really coming from the implementation of the API we are trying to use. I want to spend a little bit more time just talking about the API because understanding how it works is going to be really critical for understanding a lot of the code that you and I are going to be writing throughout this application. So just one more section to go over some of these kind of basic ideas around this API. So the first thing I want to review here is that there are going to be two API endpoints that you and I are going to really care about. The first endpoint that we're going to care about is at v0/top stories. So when we issue a GET request to that endpoint, we're going to get back the IDs of all the top stories and absolutely nothing else. All we get are the IDs. Then to get some information about each of those top stories, we're going to make a follow-up request to the item/ID endpoint. And you see right here I put :ID. That's supposed to reflect that we're supposed to put the ID of the story that we want to fetch, like say ID of 60. And that's going to fetch us information about one particular story or comment. Now, in the last section, we took a look at this diagram right here, and I had said that, yeah, we're going to make a request to that endpoint. That's going to give us some information or an item model for story number 10. And inside of story number 10 is this kids property, which is going to be a list of integers. And those are IDs of all the comments that are associated with this story. But kind of a little gotcha here. All right, let me tell you what the gotcha is. When I say that these are all the comments on the story, it's just a little bit misleading. You see, kids right here are all the direct comments that have been added to that story. If you go back over to the actual Hacker News website and you click on any of these discussion pages, you'll notice that all the discussions are kind of hierarchical, or they kind of form a structure where someone makes an initial top comment, and then people can make comments on that comment. So when we get back this list of kids that are associated with story 10 right here, these are only the top level comments that are associated with the story. So in other words, that list of kids right there would only have this top level comment right here, and then we can scroll down a little bit and find the next top level comment. Here's the next top level comment, and then the next one, and then the next one. That kids list does not have any of the nested comments that are made as a response to any of the top level comments. So if we want to actually fetch all of the comments that are associated with a story, we end up with a diagram that looks like this. At the very top is the ID of the story that you and I are trying to view. And that story has the kids list associated with it. And so maybe in that kids list, are comments or items 288, 959, and 2995. Each of these comments right here have a further list of kids associated with them. And so if you and I want to fetch the entire full comment description that are associated with the story, we're going to essentially have to recursively walk down this structure and fetch all of the nested kids that are associated with this original story. So for every single one comment that exists on a story, we have to make a single HTTP request. And we have to do all of this in a sort of recursive fetching nature, because there's no way for us to just look at story 10 and just magically get a listing of all the comments associated with it. We have to do this kind of recursive fetching methodology. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at a diagram that's going to walk you through exactly what you and I are going to have to really do to make this application happen. So everything's going to start off with the user first starting the application up. Of course, the instant the app starts up, you and I are going to want to show a list of top stories to our user. So right away, the instant the app starts up, you and I are going to make a request to get the IDs of all of the top stories. When we get back the list of IDs, we're going to take every ID and we're going to make one additional request for each one. And that's going to give us some information about each story. So this square right here essentially will get us to this point. It's going to get us everything we need for the home screen. We're going to fetch all the IDs, make one request to get information about each story, and we'll show that all on the screen. Then at some point in time, our user is going to tap on a story so they can see additional information about it. And so at that point in time, we're going to have to look at the story that they just tapped on. We're going to have to look at that list of kid IDs, and we're going to have to make one additional request to get each one of those comments. But it doesn't stop there. For every comment that comes back, we then have to look at each comment. We have to look at the kid property or the kid list on each one of those comments, and we're going to have to make an additional request to fetch each of those comments. And then this step right here is essentially going to be repeated over and over until there are no additional kids for us to fetch. So again, can't say it enough, we're going to have a lot of big issues inside this application tied to the incredible number of requests that we're going to have to make. Now at this point, you might be thinking, Stephen, this API seems crazy. Why would they design it like this? Well, they kind of have a little note in the original API documentation here about that. Somewhere inside of here, yeah, so under design right here, they essentially say like, hey, you know what? It just kind of is what it is. This is the API we're willing to offer. You can use it or you can walk away. So we're just going to use it because it is what it is. Now, one thing I want to make kind of clear here, you and I are going to make all the requests directly from the mobile device because it's going to be a very good learning experience in learning how we can kind of minimize the number of requests that we have to make to that outside API. So we're going to take an approach to this application specifically so you can learn how to manage a ton of requests. But if you and I were making a real application here, not some, essentially a learning project, if you and I were building a real version of this application, we would probably end up with an architecture that looks like this. You and I would have our app running on a mobile device, and then we would probably put together our own custom API. So this would be some outside server that you and I manage right here. And our API would be responsible for handling that tremendous number of requests that go to the Hacker News API. And so by introducing this little middle server right here, our app would be able to maybe just make a single request to our API and get back an entire story with all of its comments. So in other words, if we were doing like a real world application and we wanted to build this the perfect way, we would have our API be responsible for making all these requests rather than our app directly. But again, we're here to learn about Dart and Flutter and about strategies for handling a lot of requests, so we're not going to be building that API. Our app is not going to have it so that we can learn how to really address these big challenges. Okay, so I think that we've kind of gone over the API enough here. If it still is a little bit unclear, that's totally fine because as we go along, we're going to be making a couple of practice requests so that you can see the data that comes across from the API. So at this point, I want you to make sure that you have generated the application that we made like 2 sections ago. You should have a folder inside of your workspace directory now called News. So do make sure that you change inside of here. Do make sure that you start up your emulator and execute Flutter Run. and make sure you get your code editor open, because in the next section, we're going to immediately start writing some code. So quick break, make sure you get that set up, put together, and I'll see you in just a minute. All right, so at this point in time, you should have your code editor open, and hopefully you have your emulator running as well with our default application on the screen. In this section, we're going to talk about some of our initial approach to handling all this API data fetching. We'll then start to write just a tiny bit of code, and we'll continue in the next section with really diving into it. So I first want to tell you what our overall strategy is for dealing with this incredible number of requests that are going to our API. So what you really have to understand here is that there's really no great way for us to mitigate the total number of initial requests that go out to that API. In other words, to fetch the list of top stories here, we have to make that request to get the initial set of IDs, and then we have to make a follow-up request for every single one to get some information about each particular story. There's no way to get around that unless we go with this type of approach where we put our own kind of middleman API inside of here. However, there are strategies that we can use to mitigate the performance impact of any additional or follow-up request that is made for the same stories at some point in the future. So let's talk about what we're going to do here. All right, so here's a diagram of what we're going to do. At some point in time, our application is going to decide that it needs to fetch an item from the Hacker News API. So that might be a particular comment, it might be a story, whatever it might be, our application is going to say, oh, I need to go and get something from the API. I need to get information about some item. So to handle all the requests to attempt to fetch some API, or to fetch some item, you and I are going to make a class called the repository class. This is going to be a plain Dart class, so it's not a widget, it's not a block, it's nothing like that. It's just a plain class that's going to essentially moderate access to all the data inside of our application. Whenever our application decides to fetch some item, it's going to reach out to the repository class and it's going to say, hey, I need an item with like an ID of 10 or whatever it might be. The repository class is then going to turn around and it's going to try to access the two sources of data that you and I are going to create inside of our application. That's right, two sources. The first source that's going to be available inside of our application is something that we're going to call the News API Provider. So this class right here is going to be what is actually responsible for reaching out to the Hacker News API and requesting information about some particular item. On the other hand, we're going to have a second source of information inside of our app, called the News DB Provider. This DB Provider class right here is going to act like a cache of sorts. So anytime we fetch an item from the Hacker News API directly, we're going to take that item and we're going to give it back to our application and actually use it inside of our app. But at the same time, we're also going to take that item and we're going to cache it locally inside of a SQLite database that is stored on our device. So two sources of data, and that's how we're going to mitigate the total number of requests that are issued. This is not going to solve any problems or any issues that might come up with the initial fetching of data when our application first starts, because again, at the end of the day, we do have to make a lot of requests initially. But as long as we fetch an item at least one time, then we'll say, hey, you know what, we now have this, and we're going to hold on to that copy of the thing. And if we ever need to ask for an item with that particular ID again, we'll already have it ready to go inside that SQLite database. So to give you another take on how this is going to work, let's imagine that this is our application, or this is our mobile device, and inside of here is the flow of our application as it is trying to fetch some piece of data to show on the screen. So our application is going to start off up here, saying, okay, I need to get an item with ID of 10 or whatever ID it might be. So our application, inside of that repository class, we're going to ask ourselves a question. We're going to say, hey, you know what? Have we ever fetched this item before? Like, have we ever gotten item with ID 10 previously? And so to figure out whether or not we have, we're going to reach out to that News DB provider, and the News DB provider is going to look into our local SQLite database stored on our device. And we're going to check to see if we already have ID 10 inside there. If we do, great, but let's assume that we don't have it inside there yet. So our DB provider is going to respond back, sorry, we've never fetched that before. If you want to get the item with ID 10, you need to actually go to the real API and fetch it from over there. So our application will say, nope, don't see it. We've never fetched it before. So we'll go on to our next step, which is to use our News API provider class to reach out to the real Hacker News API, fetch the item that we're looking for, the item with ID 10, and we'll get that back as a response to our application. Then at the last step down here, our application will use that item that it just fetched from the API, but at the same time, our application is also going to hand that off to the DB provider. The DB provider is then going to take that item and store it in the SQLite database for future use. So that's the idea. That's the whole plan here. We're going to use the SQLite database to minimize the total number of requests that we have to make over the lifespan of our application. And again, for the second time to mention it right now, this is not going to really address any issues with the initial fetch of data. It's going to solve issues where a user is using our application a lot and ensure that we don't have to refetch the same data again and again and again. Now, another benefit of using a SQLite database for this is that that database is going to be persisted over restarts of our application. So if a user closes our application down, or if they restart their device, the data that we store inside this database right here is not going to disappear. So if a user then opens the application back up, they will already have a ton of items that they can immediately view on the screen without having to actually reach back out to the API to try to get that new list or that new item. So it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution that's going to mitigate a lot of possible problems. Okay, so that's the overall goal. That's what we're going to try to do here. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside this application, the way in which we're going to tackle it, is to build out this DB provider class and the News API provider class and the repository first. We're going to put all these things together, and then we're going to start working on the actual application. So with that in mind, let's flip on over to our code editor. We're going to install 2 packages that are going to allow us to create that SQLite database on the device. We'll do that right away so we can use them in the next section. So inside of my code editor, to install a dependency, I'm going to open up my pubspec.yaml file. I'm going to find the dependencies section right here, and then right underneath Cupertino icons, I'm going to add in a package called SQF. So notice the F inside there. There's an F. Lite, like so. So it's not SQLite, it's SQF Lite. And we're going to get version 0.10.0. And then we're going to get another package called Path Provider. And of course, we'll talk about what this is for in just a moment. And for this, we're going to get version 0.4.1, like so. Okay, so then I'll save this file. If you're using VS Code, you should see the Flutter packages get command automatically executed. If you're not using VS Code, or if you do not see this window appear, you can always flip back over to your terminal inside of the News project directory, and over here you can run Flutter packages git to make sure that you grab and install those packages. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to continue the next section, and we will get started with our API provider and our DB provider as well. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we started talking about our general strategy for mitigating the total number of requests that we need to make to our API. So in this section, we're going to get started working on this News API provider class. The sole purpose of this class is to reach out to the Hacker News API and access those 2 endpoints that we've spoken about. So that class needs to be able to fetch the top IDs, and it also needs to be able to reach out and fetch information about a single item. Now remember, anytime that we start working with some remote API, we're going to get back in response some amount of JSON data. Now we've handled JSON data once before inside of an earlier application. As a quick reminder on how we generally work with JSON data, we're going to use that HTTP package to make a request. That's going to give us back some amount of JSON data. We're then going to use that JSON decode function to decode the JSON that we get back. We then take that JSON data and we stick it into a model class. So before we can even really start working on putting this API class together, we need to first create a model that's going to store and represent an individual item. Now the different properties that this item or this class or this models are going to have are all listed inside the Hacker News API. So you and I are going to make a model item class or an item model class that are going to have all of these different properties. Now, quick reminder, a item inside this API represents a story, a comment, a job. It has many different forms. However, inside of our application, you and I don't really need to super heavily distinguish between the differences of a story or a comment. They share enough similar properties that we're just going to create one item model or one model class, and we'll reuse that for both stories and for comments as well. So let's get to it. I'm going to flip on over to my editor. I'm going to find my lib directory, and inside there I'm going to make a new folder called src, and then inside the src directory I'm going to make another new folder called models, and inside there I'll make a new file that's going to house the item underscore model.dart class. Okay. So then inside of here, I'm going to immediately create a class. So we'll call this thing item model because it's going to represent an item that we have loaded into our application. Now for this next step, you might not like me too much for it. We have to do a bunch of typing. So remember, on that model class, we have to create a separate field or a separate instance variable to represent every property that is going to come across from our API. So in other words, we need to add instance variables for every single one of these properties. So it is going to be a pretty good amount of typing. So to get started, I'm going to come over here to the Hacker News API documentation. I'm going to copy the entire list of fields, and I'm going to paste it all inside of my editor like so. Okay. So we're going to reuse the exact same names of all those different properties inside of our class. So the reason we pasted all this over here is I want to see the ID, deleted, type, by, etc., all these property names inside the item model. Of course, we don't need any of the descriptions on here, so we're going to go through and delete all those. Now, a very quick typo or a very quick shortcut you can use to delete all these descriptions over here. If you are using VS Code, and many other editors have this same little shortcut, but it might differ based on the editor you are using, you can go up to ID right here, and then you can highlight the space just to the left of it, or the entire tab, those two characters like so. Then you can press on Mac OS, it's Command D. If you're on Windows, it'll be Control D. And when I press Control D, that highlights everything that is similar inside the same file. And so I can essentially select all those tab characters going down. Now I'm going to move my cursor. You can see the blinking cursor. I'm going to press my left arrow key. So the cursor is now on all these lines at the very first column. Then I'll press Option right. That will take me to the opposite side of the first word on every single row. And then finally I can press Command Shift right to select the entire description and delete. So again, if you're on Mac OS, easy enough to replicate. If you're on Windows, I apologize, might be a little bit more complicated. And then for every one of these instance variables, I'm going to press the semicolon key to put a semicolon after each one. And then I'm going to prefix each one with final, like so. And that's the end of the fancy shortcuts. No other shortcuts, that's it. So if you don't want to use those shortcuts, totally fine. You can go through manually, and this is what you want to get to. Okay, so now for each of these instance variables, we have to assign a type. So we're going to go through on each one and assign a type. So for an ID, we're always going to be working with integers. For deleted right here, we're always going to have a Boolean. For type, we're going to have string. For by, we're going to be string. Time is the time at which the item was posted, either the story or the comment. That's going to be an integer because it's going to be, well, we can just look at the documentation back over here. So it's the creation date of the item in Unix time. Unix time is an integer. We could talk more about that Unix time a little bit later on. Next up is the text, which for a comment is going to be the actual comment text. So that will be a string. Dead is going to be whether or not the comment is dead. So right here, it's going to be a Boolean value, and we'll talk about what it means to have a dead item a little bit later on when it starts to get relevant. So that's going to be a Boolean. For parent, that's going to be the comment's parent, or the ID of the parent comment's parent. All IDs inside of this app are going to be integers, so that's going to be an integer as well. For poll, it's going to be some poll related thing. We're not dealing with polls at all inside of our application, so this one particular property we can delete entirely. We're just going to completely neglect the idea of polls. Now for kids is where things start to get interesting. So that's going to be the list of IDs of all of a comment's children. Or for a particular story, it's going to be all the comments that are associated with it. So for this, we're going to have a list. Now in reality, these is going to be a list of integers, but for right now, we're going to mark this as dynamic, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. So for right now, I want to have a list of dynamic variables for kids. The URL is going to be the URL that a story is referencing if it is a story about some particular link. So that will be a string. The score is going to be the number of upvotes that this item has received. So that will be an integer. The title is going to be the title of the story. For a comment, title will be undefined or null. So we'll make that a string. Parts right here is again related to polls. We're not dealing with polls at all, so I'm going to remove the parts property. And then finally, descendant is going to be the, it should be descendants. Let's make sure we get an S on there. It should be descendants like so. And for descendants, that should be the total number of comments associated. So that's going to be an integer as well. Okay, I apologize for all the typing here, but we do need to kind of get an introduction to the different properties that are associated with an item model because they're going to be very important as time goes on. So we've now created our item model class. We now have to create a constructor function that we can feed all of our JSON data into to create a new instance of that class. And so this is where we create a named constructor. Let's take a quick pause and then we'll create that named constructor in the next section. In the last section, we created our item model class and associated a ton of properties with it. We're now going to create our constructor, which is going to take some blob of JSON and try to map up information out of that JSON into each one of these different instance variables. So underneath the listing of all those variables, I'm going to create a name constructor by writing out item model dot from JSON, like so. So this constructor right here is going to receive a big blob of parsed JSON data, which is going to have the type of a map with keys that are strings and values that are dynamic, because they can be booleans or integers or strings or even lists, as is the case with normal JSON. And we're going to refer to this argument as parsed JSON, like so. Then after that, we're going to use that kind of interesting syntax to take all the different properties off of parsed JSON right here and assign them to some of the different instance variables that we have created. So the interesting syntax that we're going to use is that shorthand syntax I had mentioned the last time we worked with JSON. So on the next line underneath, I'm going to put a semicolon, and then I'm going to list out all the different property assignments. So we'll start off first with ID. So ID is going to come from our parsed JSON map, and we're going to look inside of there and specifically trying to find the ID property from that JSON. At this point, it would probably be a good little time to go and look at one of the typical responses that we get back from our actual API that we're going to use. So as a quick aside, if you want to, you can go back over to the Hacker News API. And then if you scroll down to the for an example story right here, you can click on this link and it will show you some of the typical JSON data that we're going to get from the API. So as you can see, it has an ID property that is an integer that specifies the ID of the item that we just fetched. So what we just added in right here is going to take that ID property out of that little piece of JSON and assign it to the ID instance variable that we just created on our item model. Okay, so that's the first property of, unfortunately, quite a few that we're going to have to type here. Now, if you again want to use that shortcut, you can, that I showed you in the last section, you can highlight the semicolon right here. You can press Command D to select all the different semicolons. You can press over one time to get the cursor to go over, and then Option Shift left to select every property. You can copy it, and then you can paste that down like so, and do some indenting. And that's going to save you just a little bit of time. But just in case you are not going to use that little shortcut, I will do it the long way to suffer along with you with all this typing. So the next property we're going to put in here is deleted. That's going to be parsed JSON at deleted. We'll do type. We'll do by. We'll do time. Text. Let's get that typo right there. Dead. Parent. What's next? Kids. URL. Score. Title. And finally, descendants. And make sure you get the spelling on descendants correctly. And that's going to be parsed JSON descendants. And then descendants right here is not going to have a comma at the very end. That last one will have a semicolon, whereas everything else had a comma after it. Okay, now at this point in time, I know that was a little bit of painful typing. Good news is that's pretty much the last bit of typing we're going to have to do, or at least that much. Now, I have to ask you, I have to beg you as a matter of fact, please triple check the different properties that you have listed inside of here as strings. If you make a typo on any one of these, it's going to be a lot of pain down the line. So I really got to ask you, please double check your spelling on each one. In particular, please double check your spelling around descendants. And as a matter of fact, I need to as well because I just made a typo too. It's descendants with an N, like so. So even I made a mistake. So please triple check your spelling as well and make sure you have the correct property names in here. All right, so that's the painful part. We're all done with it. So let's continue in the next section where we can get started working on our actual API provider class. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we finished up a bunch of nasty typing around our item model. Now that we've got this thing put together, we have a means to actually parse JSON inside of our application, so we can start to implement that Hacker News API provider class. So you and I are going to put together this class, which is solely responsible for reaching out to that API and accessing one of the two endpoints that we need to build our application. So the first endpoint that we're going to implement is one to reach out and get a list of all the top IDs from the API. And then we're also going to implement the ability to get a very particular item from there as well. So these are going to be two functions that we create on this new class. And that's the only responsibility for the class right now. Remember, the entire idea behind creating this class is that we want to have this kind of repository that we're calling right here that's going to sort of govern access to either our database or the API. So it's going to be kind of up to this repository right here to decide, well, should we try to fetch this item out of our cache of the database, or should we get it fresh from the API? And so we're working on the API right now. So let's get to it. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to make a new folder inside the src directory. And I'm going to call this new folder resources. So the idea behind calling this resources is that it's going to house all the different classes relating to fetching or retrieving or storing a resource inside of our application. And we're calling these items that we are fetching simply a resource. So in the resources directory, I'm going to make a new file called the news API provider.dart. Then inside this file, we'll get started first by creating a new class called News API Provider. So this class is going to have the two methods associated with it, one that is going to fetch all the top IDs and one to fetch an individual item. Let's define both those methods right now. So inside of here, I'll say fetch top IDs. I think that's a reasonable name. And then I'll create a second method of fetch item. And I think you get the idea of what each of these is responsible for. So now to make our actual request over to the API, we're going to use that same HTTP module that we had used previously in one of our earlier applications. So at the top, I'm going to import package HTTP http.dart. And remember, when we import this package, there's a tremendous number of functions and whatnot inside of here. So previously we had decided to only show the get function. Now this time around, we are still making get requests, but rather than accessing just the get function, I'm going to instead import a class called client. Okay, now we're doing things just a little bit differently here because in just a second, we're going to start writing a little bit of tests around this class right here. And when we want to test anything that makes use of this HTTP package, we have to use this client class rather than the get function directly. So for right now, just bear with me for a moment. Just believe we're going to use this client thing to issue our HTTP request rather than the get function directly. Now let's very quickly go and look at the documentation for HTTP just so you get a better idea of what this client class is. So back inside my browser, we can again go to pub.dartlang.org. Once here, we can search for HTTP. Here's the HTTP package. And then again, on the right-hand side, we're going to find that kind of hidden API docs link right here. Okay, so inside of here, you'll notice that there is a section of the library called testing. And like I just mentioned, we are going to learn a little bit about testing here, just a quick sneak peek. But for right now, let's just focus on the HTTP section of this library. So I'll click on HTTP. And then inside of here, you'll see that there is a class called client. And we can make use of this client right here to make GET requests just the same exact way that we were directly using the GET function before. Using the GET function directly, that's part of the HTTP module, here's the GET function right here, is essentially just a shortcut to creating an instance of this client class. So before we were kind of using a shortcut, this time around we're taking a little bit more long-winded approach. Okay, so back over here, we are now showing just the client class out of HTTP. Inside of the class declaration, I'm going to add a new instance variable called client. And this is going to be an instance of that client class that we had just imported. So now in both fetch top IDs and fetch item, we can make use of the client class to issue our GET request over to that API. Let's first try making a request for the top IDs. So inside of here, we can call client.get, and then to the GET function, we pass in our URL directly. So the actual URL that we want to make the request to, we can go back over to our API documentation. Here's the API documentation. And then towards the very bottom, remember there's that section labeled live data right here. And to get the IDs of the current top stories, we can use the example link, the exact one that they have right here. This is the link that we use to get all the top stories. So I can copy this link address, and I can go back over, and I'll paste it in to my GET function right here as a string. Now I'm going to zoom out just for a second so we can see that entire line. You will notice that on the very end here, there's a query string of print equals pretty. That's just to get the JSON to show up properly or kind of in a readable fashion if you make this request directly inside of your browser. And so we definitely do not need that kind of pretty print functionality when we are getting these top IDs for our application. So I am going to remove that query string, again, because it's not necessary for what we are doing. Okay, so that looks good. Let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section and we'll finish implementing fetch top IDs. In the last section, we imported our HTTP package into this new news API provider class. We then made use of it to make a request to get the IDs of the top stories from that API. Now remember, anytime that we make a request, it's an asynchronous action, and so we usually mark it with the await keyword, which means that we're going to wait for this request to be completed. So then we can take the response that comes back and we'll assign it to a variable that we'll call final response, like so. Now we've got a little red underline here on await. It's because we need to make sure that we mark any function that contains an await keyword as being an async function. So right after my parentheses right here for the argument list, I'll add in the async keyword, like so. Now when we get this response back, we have to take the response and parse it into usable JSON data. So I'm going to create a second variable down here called final IDs, and that's going to be json.decode response. And remember, the actual data coming back from this request or inside the response is available on the body property. There we go. Now we again get a little underline here for undefined name JSON. We have to make sure that we import the JSON module from the Dart convert library at the top. So at the top, we'll add an import statement for Dart convert, like so. And then that error message goes away. So then the last thing that we'll do inside of here is return that list of IDs that we just fetched. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now we can go ahead and implement a very similar function for fetch item right here. And again, the idea behind this function is to take a single ID as an argument into the function and then attempt to only fetch that individual item. So I'm going to mark this with a argument that's going to be an integer, and it's going to be an ID. And then we're probably going to make a request in here. So right away, I'm going to mark this function as being async. Then inside the function body, we'll make a request very similar to how we did previously up here. So I'll say final response is await client.get, and then we'll pass in the URL to fetch the individual item with that particular ID. Let's first go back over to our documentation again, and we'll copy paste the API endpoint for fetching an individual item. So I went up to the top of this document. You can then scroll down a little bit, and underneath the items section right here, right after that, it gives an example on how to fetch an individual item. So we're going to find this link right here, and we will again copy that link address. We can then go back over, and then I'll paste that in here as a string. You'll notice that the end of this URL also has that pretty print option, which we do not need, so I'm going to remove that. And the other thing to take note is that that link has a hard-coded ID to fetch of 8863, which is probably not what we want. We want to get whatever ID came into this function as an argument. So we're going to replace 8863 over here with a little bit of string interpolation. So remember, we can do $ID, like so. And I'll save the file, and we get a little bit of code reformatting. Now, before we add in anything else to deal with the response right here, I want to zoom out for a second. And you'll notice that both of our GET requests here and here are both making requests to nearly identical, or really completely identical, domains. And so I think that we might be able to kind of extract this portion of the string into a variable outside of our class up here. And then we can just reference that domain, and we won't have to have such long URLs that we are making the request to. So I'm going to take everything up to top stories. So I'm going to take the entire domain, the slash, and the v0, but I'm not going to take the final slash on there, and I'm going to cut all that out, and then I will assign it to a variable up here that I'll call root, like so. Now remember, anytime that we declare a variable inside of a file without an underscore, that is a variable that will be exported and usable by the rest of the world. And chances are we don't really want anyone else to see this variable here. This is, this whole public and private discussion is something that we haven't been following very rigorously throughout this course, but I think this would be a good place to remind you that, hey, if we don't want people to be able to import this root URL right here into other files, we can prefix it with an underscore. Okay, so now that we've got this variable out here, we can now do string interpolation to get it back into this URL. So I will say $_root. And now we've got a much easier to read request URL. Now we can do that same exact thing down here for fetch item as well. So I'm going to take everything up to the v0. I'll delete it, and I'll replace it with $_root. And one thing I want you to check very closely here, if you have _root and then a slash, so notice how I have the slash right here, make sure that you do not have a slash on the end of this URL. If you have a slash over here, then you're going to end up with 2 slashes inside of your URL, and the request is going to fail. So make sure you do not have one right there. Okay, so that looks good. So now we're going to focus back on fetch item. I'm going to zoom back in. And so now, excuse me, now down here, we can again take that response and we'll parse it using the JSON decode function. So this time I'll simply call it parsed JSON. And that's going to come from JSON decode response.body. Now in the previous function that we put together right here, we were just getting a list of IDs. And so it was kind of okay to just leave this as it came out of the JSON decode function and just say, hey, here's a list of numbers, do with it what you will. But this time around, we are retrieving some amount of JSON that represents an item. And so that's exactly why we just made that item model class. So we now want to take this parse JSON variable right here and stick it into the item model class that we just put together. So from the fetch item function, we're going to return a item model. So anytime someone calls fetch item, they're going to provide an ID, and they're going to directly get back a item model that they can then work with. So I'm going to make sure that I first import the item model class that we just put together into this file. So at the very top, I'm going to add on an import statement that's going to go up one directory, into models, and then get the item model.dart file. Then back down inside of fetch item, I'm going to return the result of item model dot, and then that named constructor that we just put together, which was from JSON. And into there, we'll pass the parsed JSON that we just got back from our request. So parsed JSON, like so. Okay, so that is pretty much it for our news API provider. Very straightforward in nature. All we want to do is have one function to get after one endpoint and one function to get after the other endpoint. Now we might come back to this file a little bit and add in a little bit of error handling. In addition, we might do a little bit of adjustment on the fetch top IDs function right here, but we'll get to that when it comes up. For right now, I want to think a little bit about the actual implementation and use of this class in the rest of our application. So let's take a quick pause. We'll come back to the next section, and I want to just do a quick follow-up discussion on this API provider. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.